Great to be back here with you. This is home for many of us. Have you ever heard the phrase axis mundi? Have you ever heard that? It means center of the world. And there are different cultures, and they speak of an axis, different axis mundi. There's a center of the world for them. And for me, this is my axis mundi. It's right here at Unity Village, and it's that way, yes, for you too. I want to share a lesson with you entitled Radical Generosity. We all want to prosper, do we not? We want to reap a bountiful harvest. But not everyone wants to sow. Isn't that true? Imagine a farmer. His fields are all prepared, and they have the potential, once the harvest comes, of feeding his family and a portion of the world. But he holds on to his seed. Can you imagine? He never sows them in the ground. Why would that be the case? Two reasons, at least. One, lack of understanding, and yet even more powerful, fear. He's afraid. And he's doing what most of us do as human beings, which is we judge by appearances. That if I have something and then I give it, I don't have it anymore. And so most of humanity believes that by giving, I actually create lack. That's what human beings believe. And the universe has been created in a different way. I'm a silly boy. Let me tell you what I did one time. I wanted to talk to our kids at our church about giving. And so I got myself a small ear of corn, and I counted the kernels. You know how hard that is? Can you imagine how hard it is to count the kernels of corn? I did it. And on this little ear, there were 240 kernels of corn. Except if you know anything about corn, all the corn you see, we drove up from Florida, so we drove through a lot of cornfields. They're coming along quite well. If you put one kernel in the ground, you get that stalk, and you don't get one ear, you get two. And so from one seed, you get two ears, and in this case, we're looking at 240 kernels in each one, 480. Now, those of you that are involved in your investments, how'd you like to have that kind of return? Yeah, one seed, and it's multiplied 480, and it's actually more than that, over and over and over again. That's the way God has created the universe. And you and me, we believe that if we give, if we sow, it creates lack. There's quite a dichotomy there, isn't there? And so what do? We hold on, and at its extreme, we call it hoarding. There's a great example in the Bible where the Hebrews are wandering in the wilderness. Remember, they're concerned. God's going to provide for them something called manna, daily bread. It's going to be there for them every day. And all they need to do is just take enough for that day, and all's well. Except the day before the Sabbath, they can gather a little bit more because Sabbath is a day of rest. They're not going to be working. So there's this promise before them. What do? Well, they gather more than they need. They hoard. Why? Fear, exactly. It's fear. And so they wake up the next day, and what do they find? That what they have, what they've gathered, is spoiled. It is ruined. It is unusable. Fear will do that. Is this applying to your life at all? You beginning to feel any type of an association between the things I'm talking about and maybe some of the things that we do? You know, I wrote a book. It's a very popular title. Even Mystics Have Bills to Pay. And in that book, there is a chapter on rites of passage of giving, and there are 5 of them. If one of these days I'm going to have to revise the book Because due to some circumstances I'll describe for you here today, I have discovered another one of the rites of passage of giving called radical generosity. Are you ready for that? Let me tell you how it came to be. The church where I serve, Unity of Fort Myers, my friends there, the church, members of the church for a long time, they wanted a new church home. And so we brought in an outside consultant, a fundraising specialist, wonderful guy we love dearly. And we wanted him to do an assessment of our ministry to find out, how much do you think we can raise to build a building? And the answer was $600,000, maybe at the extreme $800,000. So we started interviewing architects, 6 of them. And we interviewed them, and every single one of them said, you can't build what you want to build for $600,000. It'll take you at least $1 million. So here's Unity thinking, well, 800,000, it's not too far from 1 million. So let's just make it $1 million. That's going to be our goal. That's what we did. Then we had a town hall meeting. And there were there were a lot of wise people in that room, but there were a few people that stood up and they said, before we build a new church home, maybe we ought to pay off the mortgage on the other one. That's reasonable. And so our mortgage was about $430,000. So we had a board meeting, and what I said to the board was, you know what I want above all? I want a united congregation. I want us to be of one accord. You can probably guess what happens next. You know what we did? We raised the goal from $1 million to $1.5 million. So now we're over double what we were told could be done. And so I called our consultant, and I told him. And he said, you're crazy. And you need to prepare the congregation for failure. You need to start talking to them about, this is phase 1, and it's going to take a while, and there'll be a phase 2, and so forth. I told him, I can't do that. We have a wonderful licensed teacher. Her name is Christina Bowman. And Christina has a deep Southern accent. And she was talking to our consultant, and she said to him, you don't know unity. And that turned out to be true. Because we engaged in this process. We had a whole series of meetings in which we were talking about radical generosity. Let me tell you what that is. In our spiritual growth, you've probably noticed this, that if there's going to be a breakthrough, you will have to push into some dimension and arena of your life where you have never been before. Isn't that just logical, isn't it? You'll push into that, and you will get something called, in today's vernacular, push back. Every single time. Expect it. If it doesn't happen, you're not there. And Jesus talked about it. He said, blessed are you when men revile and persecute you for my name's sake. Now, we're not talking about persecution that's coming from outside, are we? We're metaphysicians, are we not? So we're talking about a persecution that comes from the inside. The voice that says, you can't do that. You've always failed. That's not going to work for you. Might have worked for others. Isn't going to work for you. You recognize the voice? That's the pushback that occurs. And so whenever you try to burst through in your life, it's going to come. And that's a good sign. That's why Jesus started that beatitude with, blessed are you. Blessed are you. If that happens, you're finally moving out of where you were into something new. You're breaking that negative momentum. And the same thing applies to giving. And so we were having these series of meetings. Nancy and I attended every one of those. And after every one of the meetings, I would ask her, what's our number? Which means, what are we going to be giving? And so over the course of those 15 meetings or whatever they were, guess what? That number just kept going up and up and up. Because radical generosity is when you push into a space where your ego pushes back and says, you can't do that. If you do that, you won't have the kind of retirement you want to have. It'll be to your financial ruin if you do that. And when that began to occur, we knew we were where we needed to be. That's the spot you want to be. And so you push on a little bit more, And then you know what comes? Peace. That's what comes. And you know the rightness of it. And so all of us in our congregation, we are dealing with it. We are growing like weeds. All kinds of things are happening within us. We have a commitment Sunday. We're at 2 services now, and so we want to all be together when we do our commitment Sunday. So we have a tent built over the place where we're going to build our new church. And so we're all there, and I wake up that morning, and this is our dry season in Florida. It has not rained in months. And guess what's happening? It is raining. And I mean, it is really raining hard. And, I'm a little concerned. And Nancy and I, for some reason, we're in 2 cars. We're bringing a bunch of stuff or whatever. We're driving along, and I'm having a conversation with God. I'm actually singing to God, which I won't inflict upon you. I'm singing to God, and I say, I trust you. And God's singing back, are you sure? And I'm singing back, I think so. Are you really sure? Yes, I am. I'm sure. And I'm crying. I'm literally crying. And so we arrive. We get out. It's still raining. And guess what happened? It's this Unity story. Stopped raining. And the sun came out. We had an incredible afternoon. We had painted faces, line dances, bounce houses for the kiddos. We had a chili cook-off for potluck. And at 2:30, the announcement was going to be made. I went to the treasurer. I have no idea what's going on. And he tells me a number. And I start crying. I cry a lot. You know that? I do. I start crying. And so 2:30 comes, and I'm up on our platform there, and I'm just toying with everybody because I know what's happened. And they don't. And then I finally announce it, and I say, 1 million. And they're up on their feet. $517,000. And it's bedlam. Everybody's up, clapping, screaming, yelling, crying. It was incredible. But we burst through into this realm, through this process of radical generosity, of pushing to where we feel the pushback from the ego. You want the thing to tremble. You want it to scream, no, because that's when you have it. And so if we're going to develop a prosperity plan together, what do? How do we start? We start with what we have. What else can you do? You start with what you have, but what that means is you can start. You can start with what you have. So let me tell you a story about that. There's a story in Kings about Elijah the prophet, and there's a woman, and her husband has died. So she is experiencing some of the deepest kind of loss and lack that a human being can experience. And many of you here in this room, you have experienced that with the loss of a spouse, and you know what that's like. So Elijah arrives on the scene. And because she's in loss and lack, there ought to be other signs that more lack is coming her way. It's got to be there if it's true to the story and the principles. And it is. Because she has 2 sons. And the 2 sons are about to be sold into slavery. And so there it is. And so Elijah says to her, what's in your house? What do you have? And her words are dripping with lack. And she says, your maidservant has only a jar of oil. Only a jar of oil. That's the lack. Elijah knows it's enough. It's what she's got. So it's got to be enough. And so he asks that they gather containers. So I imagine the boys are sent out. They gather all these containers that they can. So they shut the door, shut out the negativity that might be coming from someone wondering what in the world is going on next door. And she starts pouring from that tiny flask into these larger containers. And you know what happens? You know the story. It fills it up. Fills one. She's saying, give me another one. Fills another one and another one and another one. And it keeps flowing until what happens? No more containers. illustrating a tremendous spiritual principle that has got to be at the core of our spiritual understanding when it comes to prosperity, which is you receive according to your capacity to receive. If you're open and receptive, Spirit's willing. And if you're not, through guilt or lack of deserving or self-image or whatever it is, it's not. And so that's what happens. Elijah then says to her, interesting, he says, take the oil, sell it, and pay your debts, and live on the rest. Does that seem odd to you? It does to me. Because no individual of God, no man of God, no woman of God would ever imply that oil or the proceeds from the sale of oil are supply. Never. They are not supply. Our supply is something that is unseen. And so when he says to her, live on the rest, he's not talking about oil or the proceeds from the oil. Somebody can come in and steal that. You know, if it's oil, some of the grandkids eventually knock it over and you lose it. Who knows what happens to it? But you know what the rest is she's supposed to live on for the rest of her life? What she's learned. And what you're learning and I'm learning, which is you start with what you have. And you open yourself, those many containers. You shut out the negativity. You use what you have. That's the rest that you live on for the rest of your life here upon this planet. You know, Jesus did the same thing. You got time for one more story? You got one more? Jesus, feeding of the 5,000. That's a significant story. How do we know? It's in all four Gospels. And if you want to get a clear understanding of what's happening, you need to take a look at all four Gospels. And we're not going to go into it in great detail, but let's begin. That event, you know, the miracle that happened there, it started with the generosity of a young boy. If you read the stories, you'll see it. You know the 5 loaves and the 2 fish that Jesus ended up with? Where did he get them? There was a young boy who had them. And so the whole miracle started with the generosity and the giving spirit of a child. And so Jesus has the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. 5 and 2 make 7. And you know what? That's a metaphysical number, isn't it? And what does it represent? Completion. Yes. And so what it means in numbers for Jesus and for you and me is we have all we need. All we need, we have. 7. And he happens to have bread, which is a symbol of truth. And then many of us think of fish as ideas. And so that's what you really have when you've got some prosperity challenge in your life. And many of you in this room, you do. But you have all you need. You have bread. You have truth principles. And that's how you'll work your way out of it. It won't be because somebody gives you a sum of money or this happens or you get that job. That's not how you'll work your way out of it. It will be because you are applying truth principles. It'll be because you are receptive to those fish. You are receptive to those ideas. Every business that's ever been created on this planet started with an idea. Every single one of them. So what Jesus does is he takes what he has, and this is an addition to what's in the other story. He looks up, probably in today's vernacular we would say he looks within. He's acknowledging his source, and he blesses what he has. Now that's something to add to our prosperity plan. Take what we have and bless it. Then he breaks it, and what does he do with it? Does he hang on to it? No. He, like the child, he gives it. And it's in the giving that the expansion takes place. And you know the story. There are 12 baskets left over. 12 is the number of spiritual completion. And so the message is there is that the supply is infinite. And so we need to bring a few containers that is in our soul in order to experience those things. And so do you understand radical generosity, or the radical nature of our lives and spiritual growth? That you've got to push into that place where your ego gets very uncomfortable. And when that happens and it starts to scream, you are on the verge. That's the point of breakthrough. All the negative momentum is about to be cast aside, and a new life is about to begin. So friends, that's my story. What's yours? And so it is. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.